All right, wood grain. Lots of different types of wood grain with more or less subtlety, but it all starts from the same place, which is understanding what wood grain is. You probably, most of you probably know that when a tree grows, it grows in rings, and these rings are concentric. That does not mean that the rings are 100% even. It just means that they're growing around each other. Some years the rings are thicker. That typically is where there's more rain or water available. Some years they're much thinner in times of drought. If you look at a cross section of a tree, so this is like if we just cut it off, we're looking straight down, you'll see these rings. And there's actually a whole area of study called dendrochronology, which is about dating architecture and archaeological sites with wood, using matching up the rings and whether they are thick or thin to other known populations of wood in the same area. It's less reliable now that we import our wood from so far. But for example, 10,000 years ago in the American Southwest, if we're looking at Pueblo buildings, their wood sources were pretty local. They were pines up from the mountains that are next to the desert. So you go up there, you cut down your lodgepole pines, you build your building. If I say this tree ring, if I have a thin, thick, thin, thick, 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 thin pattern, and I can match that up to another piece of wood that has that same pattern, then I can start charting things back and place my structure in time from when the wood was cut. Not necessarily from when it was built, right? Because you could use old wood. I once put my parents to sleep with a lecture on that, so I will not do that to you today, hopefully. When a log is milled, it is generally cut across at these points, like this. So it's planed along and the boards are cut. What you end up seeing in wood grain is where any of these rings, where like the outer layer of what was the bark for that year and is a little bit darker, I think it's the epithelial cells. I would have to double check on that. It's been a hot second. I'm not a tree girly. I know it just sounded like I definitely am. But these cells that are on the outside protecting the core wood and the heartwood are a little bit darker, and they leave that ring. And then inside here are the cells that vector water up from the roots through to the leaves. So they're essentially like straws that are soaking things and wicking water, whereas the protective layers are the darker. You will see these darker layers. So if we come through here and we have a plank that's cut through the heartwood, and we're now looking at it on its side, what we will have, and I'm going to kind of draw a plank in a bit of perspective here, is we have that heartwood, we have the next ring, the next ring, the next ring, etc., etc. As we go through, what we're going to see is essentially lines that build up along the surface wherever those kind of protective cells are showing in the cross grain. So they're actually growing through here, but we only see that little bit. That's why on the end of a log, or on the end of a board, you'll see that it has a curved structure like this, rather than what appears to be a flat structure at first. Now, you have to keep in mind that most trees don't just grow straight up and then have one little leaf at the top. they tend to have branches. Wherever there is a branch, you have another essentially cross section that starts growing out of it. And so you can put in your little circles. All of these lines now will warp around that shape. So they will come and warp. This will come and warp around it. This will come and warp around it. So the easiest way to do wood grain, in my opinion, is to start kind of using a little bit of, if there's any perspective to your piece, following that with some lines, and then choosing a few places where you just add these kind of knots along there. And then you'll sporadically just decide where you have maybe some thicker, like some thickness. Maybe the tree got damaged during the year and it developed like a scab over, so you have like a little burl in there. And then you just start playing around with wobbliness and suggesting that in just enough places. One of the keys here to learn when you're doing patterns is you're not trying to replicate every single little tiny detail in photorealistic fashion. What you are trying to do is simply put in enough of a suggestion that your brain reads, oh, I recognize those patterns, that's wood. So if I'm doing a headboard, let me sketch in my headboard from home real quick. My headboard from home has a nice like high arch. And then it kind of swoops. So let's get that drawn in like nicely. And then, yeah, it's good enough for a demo. Okay, so I have my form. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to map in just like a few straight up and down lines. Get my grid going. Well, it's not really a grid because it's just going up. Get out this extra stuff from when I was building my shape. And now I'm going to look at it and say, okay, where are these kind of knots? I'm going to map them in first. And just think of like all the different ways a tree could have a branch sticking out and what those rings might look like. And then I'll come in and I'll draw in my other rings, trying to get back to these more up and down shapes, but knowing that there's always going to be a little wiggle to them. I can bring in my blending stick then.
You don't want it to look like the side of a barn door.
If you don't want it to look like the side of the barn door, you want it to be like less extreme.
Less rustic.
So less rustic will typically mean a finer grained wood. What that means is you're going to see less of the lines. So blend it more out, and then maybe just like in a few places, just give it like a little bit of like ticking or something. So you just look at the wood and see like how visible are these. because like mine is actually not that visible. Another thing to pay attention to is a lot of time furniture like this is covered with actually like a laminate, which typically is on a headboard like this would be the same plank but split extremely, extremely thinly, and then it actually gets flipped and mirrored. So you might end up with like shapes that kind of mirror themselves on your headboard. So just pay attention to like where those lines are, and then pay attention to how much they stand out from the general tone of the wood. And then at the end, get some graphite on there. That's probably, I probably should have, actually that's not even doing too bad. If I'd kept it a little more up and down, it would have looked more like it was part of the wood. But you could come in and say, oh, okay, and I have this like shine from a light coming onto it. So I'll give myself a little bit of a, you know, a highlight or something. So that's how I would tackle wood grain, is I tend to draw it in and then blend it until it's the appropriate level of loud. If some wood grain is so fine and cut from like a nice section of tree that didn't have any branches that it won't have hardly any of these eyes or burls. It will mostly just be maybe a tiny bit of bending. And harder woods have typically less growth in a year, so their rings will be much, much closer together. That's why they're harder, is because they're not essentially filled with layers of cardboard tubing. But if it's modern, unless it has laminate on top, it's probably, even the hardwoods are kind of like overwatered so that they grow faster, because we don't really have old growth wood anymore. So I know it feels like destroying your work, but okay. Now that it got colder, now it's too cold.
Yeah.
Any other textures? Could do glass real quick, I suppose. Glass has thickness. Is clear. There we go. Okay. What is glass? All right. Rough shape of a potential glass tabletop here. It's out of my pocket. Okay, let's give it some legs too. Okay, figure out where these legs touch underneath. Let's do some sort of thing.
Do you want us to take a picture or two of our form to reference what we
Yeah,
did,
sure.
and then put it side by side?
Yeah, that would be nice. You don't necessarily have to, but it would give me a good idea of what I'm looking at. Okay. So I definitely will see anything that I see through the glass. One thing that you'll want to pay attention to is the level of refraction on the edge. So because it comes